So now we're going to move on to using graphics to tell stories, or more formally, using graphics to reveal or highlight theories. So there are two different ways that you could think about using graphics. One is to explore your data and try and infer some patterns for what could be the relevant patterns that you should be looking for. And that is what this graphic shows. So this is a graphic where the y-axis, the vertical axis, reveals how much mail was franked by members of Congress. Now, franking is a specialized term that's used to describe members of Congress getting their mail paid for by the federal government if it's in relation to their official workload. But we're going to see that maybe that official workload also has something to do with something else. The x-axis reveals time, so this goes from 1967 to 1973. That covers 3 election cycles, which is relevant. So we see spikes in the monthly outgoing mail workload in millions of units that occur in October 1968, October 1970, and October 1972. Now, for those of you who are US residents and have been here for a while, you will know that October is when we have elections for the national government every 2 years. We're coming up on one for the presidential election, as well as all of the government seats very shortly. We see that franked mail is spiking right before the election, and then it's dropping off radically. People don't send tons of mail right during Christmas, right after they were elected. And it becomes fairly obvious from this graphic that, in fact, the members of Congress are spending more of the federal government's money. This is not a giant portion of the federal budget, but they're using this franking to presumably help themselves get reelected. So from this graphic, it's easy to infer a theory without having any knowledge of anything except the graphic and when elections are held. So I didn't come into this graphic thinking that the person who created this had a theory about franked mail. I think that they saw a pattern and decided to visualize it, and now we get to see it too. So this is creating a theory from a graphic and making some assumptions about what was going on in the head of the person who created that graphic. Another way to use graphics is to highlight a theory that you've already created. So each point in this map shows a death from cholera. And this is a map that demonstrates cholera deaths in London in the 1850s. John Snow created a radically new theory for how cholera was spread, and he demonstrated extremely effectively by using this map. So each point in this map shows a death from cholera for a specific neighborhood. It's a very small neighborhood. Each X shows a water pump. So up here you have a water pump that is not surrounded by lots of deaths. Down here you have another water pump that is also not surrounded by lots of deaths, although a few. And then in the middle, right on Broad Street, you have an X that is surrounded by cholera deaths. So Snow uses this graph to provide evidence for a theory he had already developed, which was that cholera deaths were caused by contaminated water. Now, this is a theory that we all find very obvious today, but was not an obvious theory back in the 1850s, which is not that long ago. During that time period, this is 1849, this is a graphic that had been distributed by others to highlight what ended up being the wrong theory, which was that cholera is a miasma. It's bad air that just spreads as a mist. And here you can see that this graphic is fairly accurately showing the data of who dies and where there are deaths, but it's doing it in a way that highlights the idea that it might be a miasma. Now, this graph isn't trying to intentionally deceive us. It's just trying to present the data the best way it knows how in the context of the theory that they think was right. We always present data in the context of the theory that we think is the correct one. And sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not. One way to see if it's accurate is to explore the data further in that graphic and see, is my theory supported by diving into the data? So here we see a bunch of cholera deaths surrounding this pump. But one thing that this graphic gets to show you is that there's this death up here, right next to a clean water source. What's going on there? Why did that person die? Well, John Snow says, this is a paraphrased quote, "I was informed by this lady's son that she had not been in the neighborhood of Broad Street for many months, but she did like the water from Broad Street, and so she asked for it to be delivered from the Broad Street pump The water was taken on a Thursday, 31st August, and she drank of it in the evening and also on Friday. She was seized with cholera on the evening of the latter day and died on Saturday. So even though this person wasn't in the locality of the Broad Street pump, she was getting water from the Broad Street pump, and that explains her death much more effectively than the idea of miasma, bad mist, expanding out. There's some gaps in this graph. One of those is from a brewery where the workers not only had access to their own clean water, but also were actually primarily drinking their own beer. So they weren't drinking the Broad Street pump water, which was right next to them. So this graphic lets you dive further and further into the data and show that, oh, when I look at the data this way, so many things become clear. The miasma theory didn't make things nearly as clear. So none of the prior graphics were intentionally misleading, but you can intentionally mislead with graphics. Here's how to avoid intentionally lying, or how to watch out for certain things. First, don't distort graphs to artificially emphasize key points. So Jon Snow shouldn't have drawn a circle around here. He could just let the points speak for themselves. Label your graphic and provide explanations as needed. I'll be providing a lot of base code to help you improve your labeling and graphics. You'll be learning how to manipulate those labelings in our studio as we go through. Money over time should be measured in accounting for inflation and standardized units. So per capita, per state, per relevant category. It turns out that it's really easy to get confused by the fact that people in the 1950s their starting salaries were $10,000 per year. And that was a good starting salary. So we need to account for things, accounting for changes over time and changes in population. You need to give data context relevant to the point, and that's what we'll be talking about in the next video.